Hi. This video is the third one in the series I'm making on free speech. I'll put links to the previous two videos in this series in the description of this video. Anyhow, in this video, I'd like to focus on free speech as it plays out in university environments, which is where I've been working as a professor of psychology since the mid-1990s. And perhaps we should begin by noting that it's probably a bit of an oddity that someone in the social sciences, such as myself, would be taking the time and energy to defend the value of free speech in a public forum like YouTube. Sure, there are a few others among my professorial brethren who are also doing that, but proportionally speaking, it's not too many. However, personally, I feel that it's important for academicians such as myself to make our voices heard when an issue of common concern truly merits it. And such is the case with free speech, at least in my estimation. Otherwise, people are likely to conclude that free speech doesn't count for much in the academic world, which would be the exact opposite of how I personally feel. Basically, my own sense is that the practice of free speech, as I've described it in the previous two videos, is absolutely crucial to the betterment of the human race, as well as to overcoming our world's prevailing pathologies and chronic lines of division and fracture. The second item I should probably mention by way of introduction is that all of my observations in this video are the product of my own personal experience over the last quarter century in the academic world, rather than the results of formal methodical research. And the fact that my own perspective is probably biased in various ways would be one of the limitations in the material in this video. Anyhow, with those qualifiers and disclaimers out of the way, probably the first thing to note is that in the area of free speech, American universities have undoubtedly received a lot of bad press in the last few years. And as a consequence, in the public eye, it probably often seems like our universities have somehow degenerated into bastions of what I'm calling enslaved speech, which is the opposite of free speech, and which involves the unnecessary manipulation of people's linguistic practices, mostly to suit someone's preferred ideological agenda. Probably the most conspicuous and egregious instances of this have been occurring in places like Berkeley University and Evergreen College. However, there are certainly other, less well-known cases throughout the Western academic world. So, part of what I want to do in this video is provide a kind of in-the-field reportage about the extent to which those notorious cases are really representative of what's going on in our universities more generally. Then, after doing that, I'd like to explore some of the reasons why academic environments seem so peculiarly inclined toward justifying, espousing, and promoting enslaved speech of various kinds. So, let's dig into the first of those two goals. Here the question is, are universities really as mired in enslaved speech as popular reportage might make it seem? As a general answer to that question, I'd say that the media are mostly failing to provide an unbiased, even-handed portrait of the state of the academic world. As so often happens, they're reporting disproportionately on the most lurid, most sensational cases, which tends to generate a somewhat distorted view of the academic world as a whole. Basically, Berkeley is not accurately representative of the entire academic world. Yes, the extreme cases that appear on the news are to an extent indicative of real problems in the academic world more generally, but those problems are at a much lower level on average than the media's splashly reportage would make it seem. Secondly, I'd say that the severity of academia's problems with free speech varies a lot with the specific sectors of the academic world in question. For instance, in the domain of the physical and mathematical sciences, disciplines like physics, engineering, biochemistry, and computer science, I hardly ever perceived much desire to enslave other people's speech. The problem really mostly manifests itself within the humanities and to a somewhat lesser extent in the social sciences. Okay, third, I would say that academia's problems with free speech generally seem more severe as we move up the hierarchical academic pecking order. In other words, Undergraduates seem to have a greater tolerance for hearing a diversity of alternative perspectives than master's degree students do, who in turn seem to have fewer problems with that than doctoral students do, who in their turn seem to have fewer problems with it than we professors do. And the people who usually seem to have the most problems of all are, unsurprisingly, the people whose work involves the most image management, basically the administrators at the top of the academic hierarchy. There are, of course, counterexamples to this, but the general rule seems to hold, at least in my experience. And finally, I'd say that problems with free speech in academe seem to vary somewhat with geography, and probably with the political predilections that correspond to different geographical areas. For instance, in the United States, problems with free speech seem much more preponderant in universities located in the West Coast states and in the Northeast. Fortunately, I work in a southern university that's located about 50 miles west of Atlanta, where things are comparatively laissez-faire. But believe me, if every American university were as troubled as Berkeley, I most certainly would not be a psychology professor, especially since I left a lucrative career in software engineering to do it. But my point, once again, is that I find that the extreme cases that capture the media's attention aren't accurately representative of academe as a whole. Yes, there definitely are problems with free speech in the academic world, but they're not nearly as pronounced or as all-pervasive as the popular media's portrayal frequently makes it seem. Well, at least not in my own personal estimation. However, at this point, I'd like to address the deeper question I mentioned in the beginning of this video, and it has to do with the more personal factors that generate academe's problems with free speech. So, the conundrum is, how is it that so many reasonably intelligent, well-meaning academicians, especially in the humanities and social sciences, manage to end up advocating enslaved speech in various ways? That's puzzling to me, because the more obvious, straightforward logic would be that we academicians would naturally be pretty eager to maintain the widest possible range of rationally and practically defensible free speech, especially since free speech seems so essential to any genuine form of vigorous, free-spirited inquiry into life's important issues. So the question is, how is it that so many of us end up taking the exact opposite tack? And it seems to me that this question gives rise to two more specific interrelated questions. First, what are the intellectual ideas that have made enslaved speech seem inviting? And then, what are the more personal, more dispositional factors that make it seem so? Let's look at the intellectual factors first. It seems to me that the primary intellectual ideas that have made enslaved speech seem attractive circulate around what's sometimes known as the primacy of language argument, or more specifically as the Whorfian hypothesis, sometimes also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Basically, this is the idea that the linguistic practices we engage in are powerful determinants of how we perceive and experience reality. There are also two main variants of the Whorfian hypothesis. The first, known as the strong version, holds that linguistic practices and categories completely determine reality as we know it. The other one is called the weak version, and it states that linguistic practices and categories are important factors, but admits that there are other extra-linguistic factors too. But the important point is that in both the strong and weak versions of the Whorfian hypothesis, the central idea is that language either affects, with an A, or effects, with an E, reality as we know it. Therefore, it seems plausible that changes in language can bring about changes in how we perceive and relate to reality, both personally and ultimately across the social terrain too. I bet you can see where this is going at this point. Basically, the upshot is that anyone who can manipulate the language system would also be able to manipulate human beings, human social practices, human values and behaviors, etc., etc. However, the gist of the Whorfian hypothesis gained a lot more momentum within the academic world, first with the rise of structural linguistics, and then with the advent of post-structuralism, deconstructionism, and postmodernism, which together eclipsed existentialism as the primary force in continental philosophical thought during the mid and late 20th century. And by the way, if you want to know more detail about that, you can access my YouTube video on late existentialism. I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. For now, let's just note that, like the Whorfian hypothesis, these new post-existential modes of continental thought placed a great deal of emphasis on how linguistic factors affect how we perceive and relate to reality, but this time with a special emphasis on social power dynamics, such as the allocation of privilege and social advantage, as well as the practice of defining and meting out justice. But the important point is that as the triumvirate of post-structuralism, deconstructionism, and postmodernism gained increasing momentum in the academic world, it didn't simply remain neatly confined to the domain of linguistics, but began to influence many different academic disciplines, especially across the humanities and social sciences. And with that propagation grew the notion that manipulating and controlling people's use of language can be an effective way of promoting the kind of ideological agenda that people in the academic world tend to favor, which then, naturally enough, began to crystallize into various agendas and forms of activism designed to do just that. Okay. At this point, let's turn our attention away from the more intellectual terrain of ideas and theories and toward the more personal and dispositional factors that have drawn many academicians toward espousing enslaved speech. That is, toward favoring constraints on free speech that aren't genuinely necessary, but that are merely the product of our academic ideological preferences. In my view, it's important to engage in this kind of analysis, mostly because it's really only as a function of our more personal desires and investments that abstract intellectual ideas end up seeming compelling and forceful to us in the first place. In my view, and somewhat contrary to popular wisdom, we academicians don't actually espouse ideas primarily because of their validity or logical coherence, but mostly for the same reasons that pretty much everyone else becomes convinced of things. That is, mostly when some set of ideas aligns well with how we want to see things in a more personal and visceral way. Anyhow, with regard to all of that, I'd like to propose that there are two general operative tendencies in human affairs. One of those tendencies has to do with seeing things realistically. That is, with placing a great deal of weight on reality as it is, especially in the present. And the second tendency has to do with seeing things more in terms of future possibilities. That is, in terms of what may or may not eventually come to pass. Oh, by the way, one great illustration of these two tendencies lies in a famous quote from Robert Kennedy, who said, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were and ask, why not?" Anyhow, somewhat contrary to Kennedy's famous assertion, it seems to me that the healthiest, most fruitful place along that continuum would lie in its middle ground. After all, if we're imbalanced toward just plodding along as stolid, hard-nosed realists, then it becomes difficult to imagine and then find our way toward a better world. On the other hand, if all we ever do is dream of possible utopias, then we're likely to fall into the trap of setting up unrealistic agendas that waste everyone's time and that ultimately make our world worse, which to me seems like the more common problem in the academic world today. So, in my view, the optimal position would involve being imaginative enough to envision a better world, but realistic enough to recognize and deal effectively with our world's concrete limitations and exigencies. And that's where I've noticed a fairly common failing among those who end up espousing enslaved speech. In my experience, it mostly comes out of a kind of imbalance, a chronic habit of placing way too much emphasis on trying to fulfill our dreams of building a better world for the future without an equally solid mooring in acknowledging the hard psychological realities of life as we know it in the present. And that kind of imbalance is only exacerbated by the daunting specter of Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, which would hold that if we tolerate too much free speech, it will eventually put an end to tolerance altogether. Anyhow, to me, that state of imbalance, that particular constellation of dreams and nightmares, is what makes it difficult for those of us of that persuasion to notice how reckless and costly it is to blithely let go of the value of free speech. Not to mention how often our efforts to enslave other people's speech bring about the exact opposite of the effects we were intending. It's difficult for us to notice all of that because we've become so mesmerized by our dreams of building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world that we've lost sight of the psychological necessity of allowing the human race to experience and express all that seems antithetical to our beatific vision. And it's necessary because we human beings don't grow when we're assiduously avoiding having to confront our ugliness by systematically stifling every straightforward expression of it. Rather, we human beings grow when we're actually living through our problems and difficulties rather than when we're systematically repressing them. In other words, the academic world's problems with free speech arise when we first become overly fixated on our own vision of a better world, and then we notice the recipe provided by ideas like the Whorfian hypothesis, at which point it becomes incredibly seductive to us to set up the project of trying to control, regulate, and ultimately enslave other people's speech, without taking into account the pesky reality that doing that doesn't actually make people's ugliness and darkness go away. It only buries our problems underneath the surface of purportedly appropriate linguistic niceties, much as I described in the second video in this series. Or, to put it in still other terms, improving the world by enslaving people's speech looks great on paper, but unfortunately it's a project designed for creatures other than actual human beings. And it's that hard-nosed recognition of basic human psychological reality that's missing from the equation that would otherwise bring about the utopian world of our desires and fantasies through the suppression of free speech. And that, at least in my view, is what explains the conundrum I mentioned a few minutes ago. It's not that those of us who think that way are unintelligent, and it's not that we're somehow malevolent in our intentions. On the contrary, I find that for the most part, we're good, reasonably intelligent people acting in good faith. But we've allowed our burning desire to solve our world's problems to compromise our better judgment and wisdom. So much so that it's now becoming difficult for us to even notice that that's what's actually happening. And consequently, it mostly seems to us like the world just needs to get with the program and make itself subservient to our obviously superior state of enlightenment and judgment. And when we discover that the world has other ideas, like we did after the 2016 elections in the United States, or after the 2016 Brexit referendum in the UK, or when we witnessed the ongoing rising tide of ardent nationalism in Europe, we gape uncomprehendingly, our faces frozen in a dumbfounded rictus of astonishment and chagrin. And we vow to double down on all of our agendas, only rarely suspecting that the problems we're trying to solve are actually being amplified and exacerbated by our very own projects and ideology, as well as our very own self-righteous elitism and judgmentalism. And so it goes, a self-perpetuating cycle that often makes it look to external observers like the academic world is fundamentally taking leave of its senses, that it has become an ideological echo chamber and is hence an unreliable source of guidance and wise counsel in this world, which to me is an understandable perception, but also a real shame. Anyhow, let me conclude this video by repeating what I said in the beginning. All of this is just my opinion. Yes, it's based on a quarter century of living and working in the academic world, but at the end of the day, it's just another perspective, just another fleeting fractal viewpoint in the ever-emerging vagaries of free speech and free expression. And there definitely are perspectives on all of this other than my own. So, as always, take it with a grain of salt. Or better yet, see if it matches your own personal experience. And, as always, thanks for watching. Peace out.